So I spent a few days last week in Seebeck, Washington, at a conference center nestled on the west shore of Hood Canal. Anybody ever been to Seebeck? 1, 2, 3. Okay, it's beautiful. You all should try it. I was at a retreat for ministers designed to help us rest and reset, that was the theme, for a coming season of ministry. Now, I signed up last winter, many months ago, at the invitation of a good friend and colleague from the East Coast who is also going to attend. But I hadn't really thought much about the timing of the retreat at that time, and the fact that resetting might mean something very different when considered immediately after this tumultuous election that we've just had. But nonetheless, it was a really fruitful few days. We prayed and reflected and read poetry and scripture. We heard music and worked with coaches and spiritual directors to consider the challenges and opportunities facing us in our ministries. And I left feeling more spiritually grounded than I have in a long time. And I came home and I spent some time with my family, and I was feeling so great. That wasn't until I sat down at the computer and I had to confront a very difficult situation with someone who had let me down. And that someone was the me of 2 weeks ago, who before I was feeling all peaceful and self-actualized had, for some bizarre reason, chosen the Daniel text to preach on today. I mean, I was just feeling so blissful, and then I was like, Daniel? Who does that? Now, I went back and looked because the bulletins were already printed. It was too late. I thought the Mark text looked great. The alternative first reading in 1 Samuel looked great. But no, prior me picked Daniel, and man, I'm going to have a talk with her one of these days. So then I spent the rest of my weekend just relearning all the things I learned in seminary about the book of Daniel, which was super fascinating, but not at all peaceful. And so here we are. And all I can think is that maybe my pre-retreat, like pre-election self that was planning worship way back when somehow knew that what we would need today was an apocalypse, right? Now, we tend to forget that about Daniel. We learn in Sunday school about Daniel in the lion's den. Anybody remember that? And that's like mostly what we retain about this strange little book, forgetting that the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego part, right, is merely a precursor to a very apocalyptic vision about particularly spiritual warfare, about like heavenly forces fighting with each other and a kind of projection of the conflict that's happening on earth. Okay, it's wild stuff in there. But the context of Daniel is actually really interesting, and since I had to learn about it, my peaceful self, I'd like to pass it on to you. Scholars agree that while the book purports to be about the 6th century BCE during Israel's exile in Babylon, even though it references all sorts of characters and events from that time, it was actually written in the 2nd century BCE during another painful time, namely the acute persecution of Jews by the Greek king Antiochus. So the author is like sitting here in the 2nd century in one difficult season and looking back and reimagining a former time of suffering that the Israelites went through in order to make sense of his own situation. Does that make some amount of sense? So in the 2nd century, when Daniel is being written, it was the case that some factions within Judaism had sought to align themselves with the political power in that time through some pretty nefarious means that involved compromising their religious values. But this played out in a way that sort of backfired and led to an intense suppression of Jewish religious practice. So it's a time when it became a punishable offense to engage in Jewish religious habits or Jewish worship. And for a people that long believed that God would reward the righteous and punish the wicked, this was a painful period, not only practically, but also theologically, right? This time in which, in the word of biblical commentator Brian Jones, the righteous weren't being rewarded. They were suffering precisely because they were righteous. And so the question of where is God in all this became very acute for the people in that time. And so here comes the author of Daniel with this kind of anachronistic vision of past events, which is his way of giving hope to his community, right? To have folks look back and see that during another time of intense suffering, there was another entire layer of like invisible activity, namely God, like fighting with the evil forces up in heaven in order to redeem people. That's Daniel's idea, which is really often how apocalypses work. You know, these wild visions that we see in some of the prophetic books, in the Revelation to John, even briefly in the middle of a few of the Gospels, these are strange stories that arise when a group of people really believe that they are doing the right thing, following the right path, but they are losing or suffering or being persecuted. And they begin to think maybe there is more going on here than meets the eye. Maybe there are things that we can't see, or things that we can't see yet, that explain what's happening to us. And maybe those things that we can't see or understand yet will lead to everything being made right in the end. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of Daniel's vision, although that would be super fun. We don't have time for that right now, and it's also like trying to explain somebody's fever dream to somebody. And it like involves archangels going to war with flaming swords and stuff like that, and a contemptible king who invades the land 2 times but stops, unfortunately, right after he destroys the entire infrastructure of the Jewish faith. So there's that. And you know, though you could draw some parallels between this setting and some of our own experiences, I want to be careful that we don't, I'm not saying that these are, we have experienced equivalent situations, right? We are not a persecuted minority in our context, and there still exists an enormous amount of power and privilege in this room right now. I think we need to be clear about that so we don't have a distorted visions of things. And for that reason, a lot of others, I don't want to suggest that apocalypticism is necessarily an appropriate type of thinking for us to adopt right now. An apocalyptic mindset brings with it some real hazards. It can lead to isolationism and fundamentalism and a dangerous kind of dualism that doesn't allow for the kind of nuance or empathy that Jesus frequently invited us to have. So what I'm not going to do this morning, I know some of you are going to be really disappointed, is to invite us to imagine that there are archangels above us with like lightsabers duking it out over whatever matter we're finding difficult in our own context. We're not going to do that. You can do that on your own. It's fine. But what I do find really interesting to note is what it is that seems important for folks in an apocalyptic frame of mind, right? Like, what do they feel like they ought to be doing in their own difficult time? Because maybe that could be helpful to us in times of intense pressure, personal or collective, or in times when our beliefs and actions don't seem to be bearing the fruit that we would expect them to bear. And what I notice here in Daniel 12 is a particular call to 2 things. To be wise and to lead others to righteousness. Right? Like even in times of great tumult, this vision Daniel has says, it's the wise and those that lead others to righteousness who will shine in the end. And I was reading that and I really felt called to take that to heart. I was like, thank you, previous me, you were right. Now, to be wise, as we talked about a few weeks ago, has to do with knowing what's important and making choices based on those principles, even if our circumstances make that difficult. And to lead others to righteousness is another one. In the situation that prompted Daniel's writing, that meant something like not giving up the faith, not giving up hope, or not giving up worship, even when those things didn't seem to be working in the way they used to. So those who encouraged others to keep the faith despite hardship were the ones who in the end would have the life abundant. And so I was just thinking as I read through all this, like what would that dual summons mean for us in this time, right? Like how do we lean into wisdom right now? And how do we commit to the work of righteousness and gathering other people into those habits right now? I just want to say for me, a big part of that, honestly, is supporting the life of this community of faith. Now, I know some one of you out there was thinking, I thought this was Stewardship Sunday. how in the world is she going to bring us back around from the apocalypse in Daniel to generous giving to the congregation? And here it is. But seriously, in my experience, this is the place that has helped me to become wise, in so much as I can claim that status. And this is the place that has led me to a certain kind of righteousness. And when I say this place, I mean in part Rose City Park Presbyterian Church, but also thinking more broadly about all of the communities of which I've been a part in my life and in my career in ministry. This has been the practice, these have been the disciplines, and these have been the people that have helped guide me toward what is important and what is just. And this has been the practice, and these have been the people that have given me the courage and the call to continue to pursue those things in my own life, to pursue God's will in my own life, even when it was difficult. I strongly believe that it's because of my ongoing participation in the community of faith that those two things, wisdom and righteousness, have remained aspirations for me. I believe they're the reasons that when I encounter the vulnerable people among us, I remember that my response should not be callousness. And then when I think of the stranger, I remind myself that my response shouldn't be fear but welcome. This is the place where I've practiced and been shaped by habits of selflessness and servants and patience and mercy, but also more tangibly where I've been introduced to the ideas of gender equity and anti-racism and economic justice. I want to be clear, I haven't mastered any of those things yet, but I've been held accountable to those ideals here. I've come to church almost every single week for 43 years to think about what is wise and what is right. And I've come back the next Sunday for 43 years of weeks to check in on how I'm doing, and that's been a gift to my life. And that actually isn't all. What's really important to me, where the real value comes in for me, is that whole time I've been surrounded by some of the wisest, most righteous people I could imagine, who have given me encouragement along the way, and who have made sure I kept the faith, and who have given me support and a model to follow in the way of God's grace. Now I know that in many a stewardship campaign, you might expect to hear what you are getting for your pledge to the financial life of this church. And maybe you might imagine in some narrative budget somewhere, the pastor's services might be among those things. I don't really like to think that way. That's a little transactional for me. Instead, I want to say this. I want you to know that when I pledge to the life of this church, I pledge because of you. When I make a financial commitment to the life of this church, I do it because of you. Because even though I'm the one up here, the truth is you are the wise ones that I think Daniel talks about. You are the ones and communities that have come before you in my life who have shepherded me through seasons of loss and grief, through seasons of exploration and possibility, and through seasons of discernment and struggle. Like, the truth is, we're doing it together, that you have shined for me, and I'm so grateful to be part of such a community which gives to each other gifts like hope and friendship and solidarity and faith, and above all, love. And I'm really hoping, and I hope you are too, that in the year to come, we can lean into this community, maybe like we've never done before. And we can really lean in to being a beacon to the community around us in ways that we've never done before. And I know this may look different for every one of us, that leaning in. Maybe it's signing up for a tables group for the first time and building some real relationships if we've felt kind of on the fringes. Maybe it means returning to a time of activity and commitment after a season of rest. Maybe it means considering serving as a leader or in a ministry of caretaking. Maybe it means really considering what you can do financially for the church. I think all those are ways that we support a spiritual place of belonging and inclusion and help it to thrive and help the Spirit's work to bloom among us. Because I'll tell you one other thing about Daniel, which I found really interesting. In this book, more than any other, Scholars see the Israelite tradition really considering the concept of resurrection for the first time. So that bit we heard about those who are asleep shall awake is the first time in history that the Israelites really start to grapple with this idea that there is more life than they thought. And I think that's so powerful, right? In this crucible of struggle and self-doubt, the idea of new life, the idea of more life, the idea of God's grace being manifest in a new way, in a bigger way than we had expected, that idea really starts to take shape. And of course, it takes shape in a way that blossoms in the life and ministry and resurrection of Jesus. And I just want to say I really hope that can be true for us too. That this is the beginning of a new way of thinking and being together, and a new way of living into the life that we've been promised, a way that will ultimately bring abundance to all of us as we grasp for wisdom and righteousness in our own time. So I just want to offer that invitation to you in the name of the God who created us, who redeemed us, and who sustained us always. Amen. We're going to respond in song. This is number 716. You can sing from your seats.